Preflop ranges can have a huge impact on the rest of the hand, and the difference between what GTO suggests and what population actually does can be extremely big. And I have noticed that when I worked on hundreds of node locks that I made last year. All of them were preflop. So I explored exactly how population deviates from GTO preflop at mid stakes and below, and I made a course out of that so that you can implement it into your game and exploit your population. It's called Preflop Exploits. But now that all of that just to say that I have noticed how big of an impact preflop ranges can have and how big of a deviation ranges can have. And I wanted to go through a hand that I assume will exemplify that. I haven't looked at the simulation for it, but I have looked at the hand and the preflop action, and this node is one where we usually see a big deviation from GTO. Of course, this is a high stakes hand, so the players involved will be much closer to GTO than players on mid stakes and below. But let's just use this hand as an example for a spot that you, if you play mid stakes or lower, can tackle and exploit your opponents in. And therefore, we will go through all the details according to how population plays on lower stakes, including mid stakes. So here we have Barack Whispered open from the hijack, and Kevin Park 3-bets 6-5 suited in the big blind, which is a good play, as we will see in a second. So here hijack opens for 2.5x. Big blind will have a raising range, of course, which is quite tight, only 5.5%. And queens and better always raise, ace king as well, but jacks and lower always call. Basically, jacks always call. We see actually some of these lower pocket pairs mix in some 3-bets, which will likely not happen in practice already, but that is not the point of this video. The point is looking into 4-bet ranges. So here players are 200 big blinds deep. So again, it's a little bit different than what I analyzed in the 100 big blind stacks. However, there's also an ante, so the effective stacks are a little bit lower than 200 big blinds. Still not important. The exact details are not important here. It's more about how ranges are constructed in general. So here, when the cutoff 4-bets size looks pretty all right here to me, 2.5x the 3-bet size. GTO Wizard would already 3-bet bigger in the big blind, but in practice that doesn't make that much of a difference if you play your ranges and the composition correctly. So we will not go through the composition of the big blind's 3-betting range. It's polar and includes a lot of value and some bluffs. The hijack's 4-betting range now is very tight and even more polar. So we can already see that kings mostly just flat here. And that is not only the case 200 big blinds deep, but also 100 big blinds deep. Again, not exactly the point of the video. It's important. The most important point is that we basically 3-bet extremely polar. So kings and aces, and then some ace king. Queens almost never 4-bet here, as do or as don't all of these lower pocket pairs as well. But we have these, it's only 3 hands of value hands, and then a lot of offsuit, a lot of ace x and king x suited hands that work as bluffs, right? So of course, frequencies are not extremely high for each of these hands, but we can see ace 9, ace 8, ace 7, ace 5, ace 4, ace 3, and then king jack to king 9 would include some 4-bets here. And that is simply not happening as often in practice. People don't 4-bet as often as this GTO solution would, which means, and at the same time, they also 4-bet kings more often. Again, this is 400 big, 200 big blinds deep, even 100 big blinds deep. Kings would 4-bet a little bit more often, but not extremely more often. So still, I think it's more calls than folds that the solver would go for. However, we see more value 4-bets and less bluffs as the bottom line from population here. And that has a big impact on our calling. Oh, sorry, let's go to the note. That has a big impact on how we want to play as the big blind here. So against the GTO 4-bet, we can see we can comfortably call all ace queen suited, all ace jack suited, ace 10 suited. These are in here for low frequency because we don't 3-bet them as often. We mostly call them already against an open raise. But still, if we 3-bet them, then we can always call. Same for pocket queens, pocket tens, and all these lower pocket pairs. When we are in a 4-bet pot, we have decent equity against a range that includes a lot of ace king and also a lot of ace x and king x, right? Makes sense. And therefore, this calling range against a 4-bet looks quite decent, doesn't it? Well, it does, but only in GTO, because in reality, if we see population 4-bet much less of these hands and even more of these hands, then that has an extreme impact on our range that we can continue as the big blind. So let me pull up some ranges that I actually calculated. This is the GTO 4-betting range for early positions. So the hijack in this example, 100 big blinds deep. And this is the range that data showed population was much closer to play, which does include much less 4-bets. We can already see that. So here, 100 big blinds deep, it would be even more king x that would 4-bet here, and around the same amount of ace x. Also, ace queen off likes to 4-bet here, and all of these hands are not in population's 4-betting range as often. So we see barely any king x here, a few ace x that population 4-bets in early position, then also some ace queen, but much less than GTO would. Also, ace king suited is here in here sometimes, then aces and kings as well, pocket queens even sometimes. So the value to bluff ratio preflop is much heavier tended towards value than in GTO. And the result of that, or how that impacts our range in the big blind, is something we can see as well. So here, this would be a GTO defend in the big blind for us. We could easily jam kings, ace king, some aces, even some pocket jacks here, which the solver would 3-bet 100 big blinds deep, then ace 5 suited here. And then also, as we saw in this simulation right here, ace queen to ace 10 suited can always call. Even some 10-9 can call here, 6-5 suited as well, and also parts of these other suited connectors. However, if we assume population to 4-bet less often as a bluff, as we just saw, then that range looks a lot different, right? So this is the result that we see against a 4-betting range that population plays that we just looked at, and that is much different, right? So here only aces, king, and almost ace king suited can purely continue here. Ace kings and aces being the only hands that can jam, and then ace king suited purely calls. Queens even fold most of the time, and then the only other hand is 6-5 suited that can continue here. Everything else is basically a pure fold. So all of these Broadway hands cannot continue against a range that doesn't 4-bet often enough. So let me pull up this again. The difference isn't crazy at first glance. It's not like they never 4-bet bluff or they only have aces. It's not even like that. But still, this slight difference results in such a difference in ranges that we can play as the big blind. And we can right away take away two things. First is these Broadway hands are just very sensitive to changes in our opponent's strategy. So these hands, if our opponent is 4-betting too light, you want to let go of these much more often than in theory. And the second is that the suited connectors seem to be a little less sensitive towards that, right? So in theory, already 7-8 suited, 6-7 suited would be folding a decent amount. So those becoming pure folds is not a it's not a surprise. But 6-7 suited calls purely in GTO, as would ace queen, but 6-5 suited still calls sometimes, opposed to ace queen, which is a pure fold. And the reason is simply that a hand like 6-5 suited has much more equity against a tight 4-betting range than ace queen. So when you're faced with much more aces, much more kings, much more ace king, and less of these ace x suited bluffs, then ace queen just becomes a much worse hand to have post flop, because it's dominated much more often. 6-5 suited, that is not the case. However, when our opponent has more ace kings, even more kings and aces, it doesn't hurt 6-5 suited that much, because because basically the outs that this hand has, which is more or less 2-pair plus, are still essentially the same, right? Of course, if our opponent has more of these ace-x hands, then hitting a pair more often, or hitting a pair in general, helps us more often. But we are, first of all, not dominated by any of these hands as often. So only ace-5, ace-6, and ace-6 is not played almost ever. That's what I wanted to say. So we are not dominated as often, and at the same time, these high cards, when our opponent has more of these high cards, they don't steal any of our outs, pair outs or straight outs. So hands like this are just way better to continue against the tight range. All right, so enough of that. That just as a prequel to what is about to happen here. We see Kevin call with 6-5 suited, which, as we've seen, cannot really be a bad play. In GTO, in this exact solution, 6-5 suited is also called most of the time. And then we see a flop where Kevin hits a pair. He checks. Barak c-bets here for 1/3. Kevin calls. Check on the turn. Now my hand to note froze. Let's see what happens here. Maybe in that time we can go ahead and already solve the flop. All right, this is not looking good. Maybe I have to restart it in a second. But let's already start solving the solution. We can give imposition the automatic sizing and just have a look at what the solver would do if it could choose any one size. Same for the turn and same for the river, and then we will just adjust it along the way. So cannot see the flop anymore. I think I have to pause the video and just restart hand to note for a second. All right, we're back and we can now enter the flop. Well, we wanted to go through the hand first, right? So it goes check on the turn. Then the river brings in another king. and Kevin decides to turn his hand into a bluff. And let's have a look at whether this is the solver's play as well, or if this is a punt. So he has a pair, and yeah, you might think, well, maybe he could just check it down here, hope for an ace-x hand in our opponent's range, which just doesn't choose to bluff the river. But let's have a look at whether this is the case or not. So here, if I'm not mistaken, the big blind would actually start donking here a lot. Let me just check if I did everything correctly here. Well, I think so. Yeah, so this is something that I guess doesn't happen as often in practice. Because, well, you usually think that when you're the pre-flop aggressor, you should be c-betting a lot and your opponent, or you as the opponent, should be checking mostly. However, in this exact case, it's actually the case that we as the big blind would be calling aces a lot of the time pre-flop, kings as well, queens as well, so and ace king, of course. So we have a pretty strong range here, and therefore we can actually donk bet quite a lot of the time. Not sure if Kevin is doing that. Of course, we don't know when he just checks. So let's give him the benefit of the doubt and just say he implements a donking strategy, but doesn't bet this time. So he checks. In position would then have a betting range that is even a little bit less frequent. So out of position would bet 61%, in position only 46% of the time, even when out of position has a donking range but doesn't bet. And here aces would be a big part of that, ace king as well. Kings would start checking more often, and then these lower king x hands would also try to slow play a little bit more and delay bets to future streets probably. Ace-x hands here would be suited to start betting, likely because they can get jacks and worse to fold, which would be worse hands. And yep, that is the case. These underpairs fold a lot. Let me just quickly check. Yeah, this is more a 1/3 size, so let's give in position a 1/3 size here. Even though stacks are not really in line here anyway, but again, not really the point here. We want to look at what happens on the river and then also come back to what we looked at before, which were the pre-flop ranges and how much they affect everything. So here frequency went down a little bit when the sizing went up. Still same composition basically. Aces, kings, and ace king bet a lot. And out of position would now call quite often, fold these pocket pairs and suited connectors that don't connect. Of course, any flush draw is going to call. Jack 10 with the open ender is going to call. Even 10-9 with the gut shot is going to call. And then these gut shots that come from ace jack and ace 10 call as well. Ace queen actually folds when it doesn't have diamonds, which is interesting. So even second pair would be folding here. And we have a lot of hands that are pairs and can continue here, which is probably a big reason to do so. So in reality, people likely will have less aces and maybe a few less kings. If we're talking 200 big blinds, kings will likely be in here still a lot, but aces are probably being fast played a little bit more often. However, queens are, in my opinion, in here quite a lot, 3-betting pre-flop and then calling the 4-bet. So quite accurate, I would say. Then on the turn, we get the 8. Now we don't have a donking range as the big blind, And for imposition, we see that aces would basically continue barreling, as well as ace king. Kings, if they bet the flop, now slow play the turn purely. Also, these king jack, king 10 hands, which are likely not good enough for 3 streets in this node. However, ace 9 can continue barreling, ace 4 can, and ace 3 can as well, while some of these other ones just purely check. So we do see a check here, so let's get into that line. Then the king on the river is a card that we as the big blind would be betting a little bit less than half the time. So here basically our nuts want to bet, which are kings, queens, and then some ace king only bet sometimes. Pretty combo dependent here actually. So diamonds don't bet. And then ace of clubs, king of hearts also doesn't bet. So hearts and diamonds basically are not the best bets, I guess. And yeah, same for the suited ones. Ace queen checks, ace jack checks. When it comes to bluffs, we see jack 10 is basically the main bluff here, and then also some 10-9, but anything other than that does not bluff. Any pair is actually checking here, including 6-5. However, that's where we want to come back to what we saw before. If we adjust our preflop range to not have as many Broadway hands in our preflop range as we would in GTO, then of course we don't have Jack 10 here, we don't have 10-9 here, and we cannot bluff them here. So I'm not sure if Kevin was aware of that he already adjusted his preflop range. I'm sure Barack Whispered is able to find some bluffs here when he 4-bets preflop. Does he hit the exact right GTO frequency, or does Kevin think he might even still be under bluffing here preflop? Who knows? Might be. And if that is the case and Kevin thinks he just doesn't continue with as many Broadways here, including Jack 10, then of course he has to use other hands as bluffs. So let's quickly rerun the simulation and simulating that as the big blind we do not have Jack 10 here, we do not have 10-9 here, and even let's just say we never call these Broadways either and only have some of these lower. Let's also get rid of these pocket pairs and only keep in some of these suited connectors, and then see what the simulation tells us to do on the river. Now, first of all, we always donk. Again, not 100% recreatable, but let's just say we don't donk here and always check, which might be closer to the actual strategy than a pure donk, which obviously is not happening. How do we... Always the same here, right? I had this last video. Why is it locked? Why is this locked? I want to remove this. All right, now we got it. Now run this. What is happening? Now imposition only has a jamming range. Why? All right, so if we donk here purely, then imposition would never bet, which makes sense. So now can we just copy this strategy and move it over to the other one? I'm not sure. Can we do that? In POSolver you can do that. I'm not sure if we can do it in here. Strategy. No, I don't think you can, right? Can you not copy the strategy? All right, I'll think of something. All right, so I just saw that you can, or you will be able to copy and paste these strategies here, apparently. Not now, however. So what we'll do is we'll just apply a 45% betting range here, which is quite arbitrary, but this is, I think this is close to what the original simulation was doing here when we did have all the broadways. So let's just pretend like Barack would play this strategy. I don't think that's too far-fetched. Wait, did I mess it up again? 45%, I have to lock it, of course. Nice, all right, against the bet. Now, again, we have a huge range advantage apparently because we don't have all of these broadways. So we just check raise like a maniac, including 6-5 a lot and a lot of these pairs here. So ace king would actually now just start folding. So a lot of wild stuff going on. I think, yeah, it's always a little bit dangerous to just change one thing and then let the solver calculate everything, because it, as we can see, one little change or a few little changes in preflop ranges just completely change everything in the post-flop strategy. Well, I think this is, by now, this is already a little bit wild and far from what's happening in reality. But let's, for fun, let's just go through the process here and pretend like imposition would then barrel for 1/3 here on the turn, not for a jam. Then, oh no, we actually see a check, right? So, and now in this wild configuration, which I think can still be quite accurate for reality, because yeah, we do check call some aces, some ace king. People will check raise a lot on this flop as well, especially with value hands, probably less so with 6-5 of hearts or a spades even, but whatever. I think it does give us something to look at for the river, which is that now when we don't have these Broadway hands to bluff with, so any hand we have here is at least a pair, then a pair or pairs become bluffs here, right? So the lowest ones, third pair, 7-8, and bottom pair, so 6-5, would now be bluffs. And over pairs, aces are pretty much checking always. Then ace king is mostly checking. That was the same before. And yeah, queens goes for value here. So however you want to look at this, whether Kevin assumed he doesn't have all of these Broadway hands that could be bluffs and now has to bluff something, or he just went for a play that was aiming at some exploit. For example, if you thought Barack has not enough ace king here on the river, not enough queens, kings, maybe aces that he could call, and he would just win the pot enough of the time, even if he did have some of these broadways and just went for an overbluff. We don't know. But I think for us as players, I think the most important takeaway here is if you are, I think the more important takeaway here is for us being, actually for both for us as the big blind, we can make the biggest exploit pre-flop by not calling all these broadways. And then if you on the river, of course, it depends on what you want to do. Do you want to exploit your opponent by, or do you want to still have a balanced range on the river, which does have to include some bluffs? If so, then you would have to turn some of these pairs into a bluff. However, if you already made an exploit pre-flop, that likely assumes your opponent is not a GTO bot. And if he is not a GTO bot, then you don't necessarily have to have a balanced range, not pre-flop and also not on the river. So you might as well decide to not bluff here at all, maybe, especially if you already assume your opponent is 4-betting pre-flop with a 2-value heavy range, right? So if you assume hijack in this example has almost always ace king, aces, maybe some kings, and then almost no ace x suited here as a bluff, then why would you bluff here, right? If you're getting called 80-90% of the time, then not having a bluffing range at all is the best exploit you can make here. At the same time, as in position, if you are the hijack and you assume your opponent is somehow aware of these mechanics or these dynamics that they exploit or adjust preflop and not call enough of these Broadway hands, then you know that when you face a shove on the river here, you will not see one with Jack 10 as often, with Ace Jack or maybe even 10-9, because your opponent might not even have these hands in their preflop range. And if that is the case, then first of all, slow playing makes less sense on the turn, just because if you're not getting bluffed on the river, then you might as well just collect the money yourself by betting. And at the same time, bluff catching on a river like this is going to be less profitable for you, because you're not going to face a bluff as often, especially when people are not capable of turning pairs into a bluff, which Kevin did here. And most players at lower stakes do not tend to turn pairs into bluffs as often and not be as range aware as Kevin is here. I hope that clears up something about preflop ranges, how much you can actually exploit people preflop. If you're interested in more spots and more data on how population deviates from preflop GTO ranges and how you can exploit that by adjusting your ranges, check out my course. I link it below. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video.